Run and gun games were typically games where the player scrolled usually left to right, but also vertically, often at their own pace, on foot, shooting weapons along the way at whatever represented a bad guy in the game. Arguably, these games all stemmed from Taito's 1975 arcade gunfight game, or Western Gun as it was known in some territories. A simple two-player affair where two cowboys take potshots at each other through sporadic trees and cactus plants. It paved the way for this genre to flourish as technical advancements saw more interesting gameplay. Enter Nintendo's 1979 classic Sheriff, which ups the ante somewhat with the player surrounded by bandits for him to shoot his way out of trouble. In 1980, SNK took a similar but flamboyant approach with Suzuki vs Commando, which had you play as a samurai fighting off vertical waves of ninjas raining down on you. The vertical approach was improved on by 1982 with Taito's Japanese hit Frontline. Although it had a mixed reception in the Western market, it certainly laid important foundations for undoubtedly the game that really cemented the vertical run and gun genre in our gaming history. That game is, of course, Capcom's classic, Commando. Originally released in 1985 and distributed by Data East amongst others, Takuro Fujiwara's simple but extremely popular game that he was developing alongside Ghosts and Goblins quickly became one of the highest grossing games of 1985. You play as Super Joe, who must single-handedly kill hordes of oncoming soldiers until you reach the final fortress or base and destroy it. Armed with unlimited ammo in your machine gun, which you are able to shoot in any joystick direction, you also have grenades that can only be thrown forward regardless of which way you are facing. At the end of each level, big gates open up and a swarm of soldiers attack until you defeat them all. There are 8 unique levels to complete before it loops back round, with the baddies becoming quicker on their feet the second time round. The name of the game in Japanese actually translates to Wolf of the Battlefield, although this isn't the strangest variation to the game. Up until recently, Germany, and specifically West Germany in the 1980s, had strict rules about what could be depicted in video games, understandably after the events of the Second World War. Commando could easily be interpreted as a Second World War game, with the artwork, vehicles and the general appearance of the enemy sprites clearly wearing grey uniforms. This was too much for the West German censors, and the game in its Commando form was banned from the country. To circumvent this, Capcom altered the game sprites of the enemy soldiers to robots or alien invaders instead. Hoverbikes and spacecraft replaced vehicles, and the name of the game was changed to Space Invasion. Here you can see the difference in the arcade versions on level 1 of the game. The Commodore 64 version of Space Invasion is more interesting to me though, as the sprite replacement has more of a Star Wars feel about it than the arcade one. It was kind of cool wiping out all the stormtroopers in the game that I really thought I knew everything about. There are AMSTRAD versions of Space Invasion too, but I couldn't find any Spectrum ones. Perhaps the popularity of the Spectrum in Germany was too small for them to bother, although it is mentioned on this brilliantly altered artwork. So, Commando was pretty much ported to everything by 1986. If you had a home computer or console in the mid-80s, chances are you could play it on your system, with varying degrees of playability, but mostly a positive experience was had. Taking a quick look at some of the 8-bit offerings before we focus on the big 3 home computer versions in the UK at the time, you can really see how they went about squeezing the game into everything. Here we have the Atari 2600 version, which honestly does a pretty decent job with the limitations of the system. The Commodore 16 version is also interesting. Although fairly basic, it seems to run at 1,000,000 miles per hour, with a big caveat at not being a scrolling game at all. Each screen is its own area. Speed is not the order of the day for the BBC Micro version either. Although colourful, it's a dog of a game. Some versions, like the NES one for example, added extra bunkers and items that you could unearth and explore, which I personally think was a great addition to the game. The NES port is pretty decent, although it's not without issues when a lot is happening on the screen. Of all the 8-bit ports, the Commodore 64 version is probably the closest to the arcade visually. It's very brown, which can be said for a lot of C64 games, but so is the arcade version, and it certainly looks pretty good at face value. It scrolls fairly nicely and really zips along, probably a bit too quickly at times, but always copes with the amount of shit going on at once, even though it has a weird flicker issue sometimes, to the extent Super Joe just completely disappears off the screen. Some of the vehicles are interesting. I swear at one point I saw a pink Cadillac drive past. The controls are a tad annoying too. Being joystick only, having to use the spacebar for grenades is awkward at best. I read a comment somewhere that one kid admitted to putting his bread bin on the floor when playing it and using his feet to dispatch grenades. The main gripe though is it only has 3 different levels, which was also much to the disgust of the reviewers of the game in Zap magazine, who were fairly scathing about how much was on offer. Even though it is fairly short, I mean if you're any good at the game you can finish it easily in under 5 minutes. It does at least loop around, which even the versions with more levels do anyway. You also get a fortress at the end to destroy, which is absent on both the Speccy and AMSTRAD versions. The definite highlight of this version over all the others, including the arcade too, is the utterly superb soundtrack by the legendary Rob Hubbard. The story goes that Hubbard was hired to do the music by Elite and was left alone in the offices at 10 PM one evening after going out for dinner with the bosses, and he had finished the score by the time staff were turning up the following morning for work. He left the music running on all the computers that were left on in the offices, grabbed his paycheck and hopped on the train home. Job done. The AMSTRAD version is a different beast altogether. It almost looks like a new game made to look like an 8-bit one, if that makes sense. It's so chunky and wholesome looking, I just want to smush it. Gameplay is on par with the Commodore version, not quite as zippy, but that's no bad thing necessarily, but there is a definite slowdown on busier sections. It's nice to be able to play on a keyboard though and redefine the keys, so it makes the grenade throwing easier, although I seemed to throw them if I held the machine gun fire button down as well for too long, which was annoying. The sound, although not up to the C64 version, is pretty decent, and level design works quite nicely with, I might be wrong, 8 levels, but then small changes make the loop feel less like one. The caveat to that is though you never really have a sense of completing the game due to the lack of the fortress towards the end. The game featured in the June 1986 edition of AMSTRAD Action, who really liked the game but found it frustrating at times and just a little mindless. The Spectrum owners also got a very good port too. Massively lacking in any sort of music is the only real drawback compared to the other two offerings. The lovely bright yellow desert-like backdrop works brilliantly against the clear enemy sprites and our hero. There is a nice use of colours that do spill over each other if Joe or the enemies get too close to them, but it makes the levels feel like there is more going on than there is. Like the AMSTRAD and C64 versions, everything moves at a great pace and it's easy to see and manoeuvre around oncoming bullets and grenades. Exactly the same menu and options as the AMSTRAD version, so it also gains by having a redefine keys option for better placing on the grenade key. 6 distinct levels on offer here that, like the AMSTRAD version, don't feel like they have a big ending before looping around again. Not that I ever got that far, as it's a pretty tough game. I think as far as a conversion could have gone from the arcade down to the Spectrum, I'm not sure what they could have done better, honestly. Crash Magazine agreed, giving the game a whopping 94% in its 1985 Christmas special, and it's difficult to disagree with them. So how to separate them? Well, in all honesty, this is the closest battle I've had to do. All 3 versions have their strengths and weaknesses, but all 3 of them are pretty damn good at recreating the arcade experience on the hardware provided. Especially when you play versions like the BBC Micro one that clearly didn't. All games of the big 3 got a pretty good treat, quite honestly. But I do have to pick one. We can't be here all day. So, in 3rd place, I'm going to go for the AMSTRAD version. And the reason why is just down to 2 things. Firstly, the slight slowdown when the screen gets busy. It's quite noticeable, but not bad enough to ruin the game. And secondly, the chunky sprites. Although I actually love them for nostalgia regions, they don't compare to the better defined sprites of the other 2 offerings. And it almost looks a little bit dated in comparison. But it is a cracking conversion, but just falls short of the other 2. So in 2nd place, and to be honest, I nearly gave it the top spot before I removed my rose tinted glasses, is the Spectrum version. Which means the Commodore version wins the 8-bit battle this time. Yes, the Spectrum version has more levels. Yes, the colour palette is better. Yes, it's just as zippy to play. But the Commodore version really did replicate the arcade version so well. It's just difficult not to give it the top prize, honestly. Okay, only 3 levels, although there are longer versions of the game now that have been re-released. But I can understand the criticism the game got at the time. But that Rob Hubbard score, man. And those graphics, with a proper Fortress ending, which the other ones didn't have, far outweigh the shortness of the game compared to the Speccy and AMSTRAD versions, which honestly just felt like you were looping on forever anyway. So, yeah. Definitely the right call, I think. Very, very close call, but I think the right one. But please let me know your thoughts in the comments and your memories of any of these versions or any other ones mentioned here, like the NES one. I mean, did anyone actually enjoy the BBC version? I'm thinking not. Anyway, I'll leave you with a bit more Space Invasion gameplay on the Commodore version, which is arguably the better than the original game, I think. The sprites, I don't know, they're just better. I just think it's cool having that kind of Star Wars vibe to it. And I'll also show you the current running scores for this 8-bit battle series. So as always, thanks for watching. Bye for now, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers, everyone.